Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this webinar. It's organized by Revive the Peace Movement, the Afro-Socialist and Socialist of Color Caucus of the DSA, and the Sanhati Collective. My name is Swati Birla, and I thank you for joining us, and I thank you to the speakers, Lashona Austria, Rohini Hensman, and Vikas Rawal, who will be speaking today. I'll introduce I'll introduce the speakers shortly. Just a quick shout out to the balladeer, the protest balladeer Pujan Sahil, who has created this song, the Bella Ciao song that we heard just now. Um, so, as the farmers' protest in India has prolonged and it has intensified, and as the state has been responding with increasing authoritarian violence, there have been many expressions of global solidarity with the farmers. And in that spirit, this panel brings together activists from Black farmer struggles in the US, especially in the southern states, and activists who have been involved with farmer struggles in India for some time to sort of come together and share in a public way the context and the specificities of their struggle, their historical sort of trajectories, so that we can see, in a certain sense, how something that the solidarity expressions are revealing about the way in which movements intersect, their politics intersect, or their concerns sort of overlap with each other, which means that while they were bounded by their own histories and their own context and their local context, there's a greater need for sort of them to come together. The Black struggles, for example, have been bounded by their own histories in the US, and they're making very interesting innovations about solidarity economies, cooperatives, and greater control over the distribution, to the struggles to take back land. I think uh, we're more in tune to the increasing need for conversations between struggle. In the same sense, the crisis for land, livelihood, food, ecological life is not simply global but linked. And I mean, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and as many of you might remember, when when the COVID crisis started, the first things to disappear from our like from the supermarkets, were food, and there were many complaints about empty shelves and panic buyers and hoarders and so on. And what that revealed is this intimacy, or the linkages between the food supply chain, from the farm and the dairy to the retail to the food processing units to the transportation workers and the supermarket workers. So, in the panel today, in the first part, we'll basically spell out what the local context is, and it will sort of also reveal the places in which there are interdependencies between movements and between farmers with each other, and workers with each other. And in the second part of the panel today, we'll talk about the futures of the struggles themselves and the kinds of futures they are imagining, in how they are thinking about, uh, you know, all of these questions about livelihood and food security. In many senses, the farmers are at the frontiers of the struggles today, and they're putting back in a very solid way and in a very forceful way the question of how food is produced and distributed, and how it is sold, and how we consume it. And they're revealing the links between the production and the consumption, and how we need to have a politics of both at the same time. And they're putting all of these questions back on the table. So, in the second part, we'll really talk about, what how they're encountering these new ways of doing food politics. They're also taking on increasingly authoritarian states, so they have a lot to teach other movements about how to take on the state which is repressive, how to take on state when it actually has a lot of control over the media. So how do you produce your own media? How do you produce your own political grammar? And in the second part, we'll talk about the politics and the food sovereignty question. So, without sort of further ado, let me introduce the panelists. One of our first speaker is Dr. Vikas Rawal. He's a professor of economics at the JNU University in New Delhi. His research straddles agricultural inequality, food security, and issues of human development in India. Professor Rawal has been following and been participating with very closely the farmers' protest in India since its inception last year, at the tail end of the last year. Our second speaker is Lashona Austria. She is a member of the executive committee of the Afro Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus within the Democratic Socialists of America. She is a community organizer, she's a farmer, she's an ordained faith leader. She has a fierce commitment and a deep experience in building strong and vibrant solidarity communities. She is a farmer herself, and she collaborates very closely with rural communities and faith based and secular organizations. And our last speaker is Rohini Hensman. Rohini is a writer, independent scholar, and activist working on workers' rights. She has written very extensively and followed very extensively workers' movements and anti-imperial politics. And her most recent books are Workers' Unions and Global Capitalism, Lessons from India, and Indefensible Democracy, Counter-Revolution, and the Rhetoric of Anti-Imperialism. So in the first part, what we'll do is we'll have each of the speakers speak about their specific context. We'll have the two India speakers go one after another, and then we'll have Lashona talk to us and walk us through the Black farmer struggles now. So, Professor Rawal.
Hi, thank you, Swati. You see, let me just give a quick overview of what the farmers' protests in India are about, and what are they protesting, and what has been happening. These protests, farmers have been protesting in very large numbers against three new laws that have been introduced. These laws were introduced clearly with the intent of furthering corporate penetration in the entire food supply chain, starting from production to marketing to retail. So the three laws, in fact, deal with these three different stages of the supply chain. There is a law about contract farming, which essentially provides a national framework for deregulated contract farming between companies and farmers. There is a law that basically deregulates agricultural marketing. In India, agricultural marketing is regulated by the provincial, by the state governments, and through a system which allows them to regulate, to impose taxes, and to impose systems of transparency and regulation of trade, so to basically prevent farmers from being duped by traders and intermediaries. So the new law, the second law, provides deregulates that entire framework and opens up agricultural marketing, in particular for big companies and big traders, to basically directly procure food from farmers without state having any role to play in regulating it. The third law deals with the retail, where government has once again weakened considerably its regulatory powers on retail. In now on retail, the most important law that gave regulatory powers to the government was what is called the Essential Commodities Act, under which government could impose limits on the stocks that private operators can have, and those limits have now been practically removed, which basically means that big companies, big retail chains, for example, can hoard massive quantities of food and agricultural commodities. And given the kind of imperfections we have in India, this could result in big suppliers being able to manipulate the markets in such a way that consumers pay very high price and producer prices are depressed. So you basically use your control on this entire supply chain, from production to marketing to retail, to on one hand depress producer prices, so farmers are in a crisis, and on the other hand raise retail prices, so consumers pay more. So all of this to basically increase the profit margins. Now, in Indian agriculture has been facing a crisis for quite a while now. And this crisis is the making of, most importantly, the making of neoliberal economic policies, as part of which, on one hand, state has withdrawn from both direct provision of services and inputs and regulatory powers on provision of, on how uh, seeds are priced, how fertilizer is priced, and so on. Which basically means that the farmers are dependent more and more on private companies providing these inputs and services, resulting in a steep increase in cost of production for farmers. And on the other hand, trade liberalization, which has worked to depress the producer prices for farmers. So farmers' margins have decreased so much that for most crops, anything between 80 to 90% of farmers routinely incur losses. You see, so farmers are incurring losses, and the only uh, key provision that farmers had, which protected them to some extent, was a system of public procurement, which is basically government system under which government procures rice and wheat from farmers at a specified minimum price. Now farmers are fearing that this entire system will go. Now all of this, fearing this, that the system of public procurement and public regulation, which provided them some minimum protection, is likely to be threatened by these new laws. Farmers have been on the street. Now, I mean, we are more than 90 days, it's been more than 90 days that farmers are protesting at the borders of Delhi. We are talking of hundreds of thousands of farmers in very large numbers. They arrived on the borders of Delhi on 25th of November, and they've camped here for now almost 3 months. They've faced the worst winter of Delhi, and now they're facing terrible summer. And but they've been at the borders protesting, and that's essentially where things are. Maybe I should stop here for now, and I can come back later if there is time and talk more about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, Rohini.
Okay. Actually, I'd like to start with an event which at first sight seems to have nothing to do with the farmers' struggle, but I'll explain how it does. After the countrywide lockdown was imposed in the last week of March 2020, life came to a standstill. But by April, there was a massive exodus of migrant workers from towns and villages throughout India, tens of millions of them trekking back hundreds of miles to their home villages, mostly on foot, a few on bicycles, a few catching lifts from trucks for part of the way. They encountered searing heat because that's the summer, and brutal treatment from the police, beatings, being locked in stadiums converted into open air prisons, sprayed with chlorine disinfectant, but still they persisted. So, who were these people? And why were they undertaking this journey in the midst of a lockdown? In fact, these were family members of some of the very same people participating in the farmer struggle. Small and marginal farmers, and especially agricultural laborers. Unable to make a living in their villages, they migrated to towns and cities looking for work. And the only employment they'd been able to find was unregulated and extremely exploitative, often through labor contractors and with absolutely no security. Some of them were sleeping in their workplaces, others got together and rented a small room in a slum, packed together like sardines. When the lockdown was declared, employers suspended production and contractors vanished. often without even paying workers for the work they had already done. So these people living from hand to mouth with hardly any savings, what could they do? Those who lived at their place of work were booted out at once. Those in rented accommodation were soon booted out by the people from whom they were renting. With public transport suspended, they decided to walk to their villages. But hadn't they left their villages precisely because they couldn't make a living there?
Yeah.
An interviewer asking this question got this answer: if we're going to die anyway, we'd rather die with our families at home. Now, what this spectacular long march highlighted was three linked crises. One is the crisis in agriculture, which Vikas was talking about, which was in a dire state even before the three new farm laws. Rich farmers constitute a small minority, and the remaining at least 85% are medium, small, and marginal. Every single day, farmers are losing their land and joining the already large number of landless agricultural laborers. Every single day, indebted farmers and agricultural laborers are committing suicide. And the rate of dispossession and suicide has accelerated under the present government. The only lifeline they have is their land, and they can hang on to that only so long as they get paid the minimum support price for their crops. And what awaits them if they lose their land? No new industrial jobs are being created, and even existing ones have been destroyed in the past few years. Graduates are competing to be employed as waiters or unskilled workers. The kind of employment these migrant workers have is practically all that's available. Working for the agribusiness companies might be an option for a few, but not many would get those jobs, and even those who do would find the terms humiliating. This points to the second crisis, the crisis in employment. Looking at the labor laws before they were quote unquote reformed, also during the COVID crisis, you would have thought that they gave Indian workers strong rights, and they did. But the laws applied to less than 7% of the labor force. The rest had to fight to survive and could lose their jobs anytime without any, especially if they tried to organize or ask for higher wages. The third element in the crisis is the virtual absence of social security. Vikas was talking about the procurement system. Now, from, uh, coming out of that, there's a public distribution system which offers a few food items and kerosene for cooking at highly subsidized rates to below poverty line households. These entitlements had been expanded by the Food Security Act under the previous government, but that is not being implemented properly. However, it is better than nothing, and migrant workers could expect to get their rations back in their villages. A second measure is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or NREGA, which was also enacted by the previous government. It offers 100 days employment in public works at the minimum wage to one person per rural household per year. Again, that's not much, but it has been a lifeline for some of the families of the rural poor. And some migrant workers who returned to their villages tried to get employment through this scheme. Unfortunately, NREGA too is not being implemented properly. For the vast majority of the population, an abyss opens up beneath their feet if they lose their job or their land. So no wonder the rate of suicide is so high. Okay, I'll stop there and carry on later.
Yeah. Thank you, Rohini. Lashona, right.
Hi, thanks for having me. Swati, it's really difficult to even begin a conversation about Black farming in the United States of America without going back just a little bit in history. So I'm just going to touch on a few highlights and try to answer your question. Um, Really, the story of Black farming in the U.S. dates back centuries. And certainly we know how this country was situated and the racist history of the United States. And so I think I want to go back to the story that we've been told in history in school and in our history lessons and in our textbooks in the United States about 40 acres and a mule back in 1865. That allowed for former enslaved peoples to take possession of land. And we hear that story. But through this order of like 400,000 acres of farmland, certainly it was settled by about 40,000 Black people in this country. But the order was really it was quickly removed, just like a year later when President Lincoln was assassinated, and a few months later Andrew Jackson demanded that the land be returned. So this was a short-lived promise, and it's to bring that really full circle to today. This may have been one of the first promises broken in America toward Black citizens, and then continuing throughout history, more and more promises have been broken. And so the United States has a history of discriminating against Black farmers, and it continues even today. Back in 1920, there are around 1 million Black farmers in the U.S., owning approximately 15 million acres of farmland in this country. But due to racism across this country and through from the USDA and many other sectors as well, Black-owned farmland has seen over a 50% decline since 1910. And I'll move quickly just to give a few other highlights as well. Back in 1934, the Farm Security Administration was formed in this country, and that was from what used to be named the Resettlement Administration. And so the purpose of the Farm Security Administration was to provide rural poor people with property ownership. So this created hundreds of new farming communities in the U.S. And among these resettlement communities, 13 of the communities were Black. And so these Black communities played a role in the civil rights movement back in the 60s, approximately 25 years after being formed. But unfortunately, the Farmers Home Administration Act of 1945 led to the constriction of the Farm Security Administration and loans being distributed to these rural American communities. So the Farmers Home Administration effectively ended New Deal rural property programs and made it extremely difficult for folks to acquire credit. Due to racial bias in this country. So Black farmers were either unable to secure credit due to racial bias, or they were fearful about making their financial information even available because of potentially dangerous white farmers waiting to take their land from them. So this is really a story in this country about land and about access when it comes to Black farmers. And so many Black farmers were able to even, secure the credit they needed to do what they wanted to do, and be able to purchase land to do their farming. And then I'll fast forward just a little bit to a real historic case here in the U.S. Called the Pigford versus Glickman lawsuit. It was a lawsuit between grassroots efforts of Black farmers and social justice organizations and legal teams and the USDA. And so Timothy Pigford was a Black farmer that represented many Black farmers in this country, and who basically said that between 1981 and 1996, the USDA was discriminating against Black farmers by denying loan requests. And so many Black people were unable to become farmers, were unable to acquire land due to being unfairly prevented from receiving the necessary loans and property and to be able to properly purchase their land. So this is really historic. In a historic lawsuit, and folks can definitely do some research on that and see all the things that came from that. But I think I'll back up just quickly to like 1967 when the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights and investigated discrimination claims from Black farmers as well. And the investigation found that not only did Black farmers receive consistently smaller loans than white farmers, but that between 1964 and 1966, Black farmers received 129 ownership loans compared to white farmers receiving over 1,000. And so we continue to see this disparity and this gap here in this country when it comes to the way Black farmers are treated versus the way white farmers have been treated historically in the U.S. And so again, this led back then, this led to protests all throughout the country. And at that point, the USDA didn't receive any sort of backlash or any consequences for the treatment, but not until 2012, when we see this case against, the Pigford lawsuit. So back in 2012, Black farmers were like 1.4% of the country's 3.4 million farmers. You start thinking about those numbers. That's around 48,000 Black farmers in this country. So a very small percentage. And so nationwide, about 0.5% of farmland is owned by Black farmers in this country. And so when we look at these statistics and these numbers, we see it's just a real stark difference between how Black farmers are situated and how white farmers are situated in the United States. And so from between 1910 and 2007, Black farmers lost over 80% of farmland due to racial discrimination in this country. And because of the lack of support from the USDA, historically this has given Black farmers have certainly been sort of on the bottom of the equation when it comes to farming and access in the United States. And so I think I'd like to also just say that there's definitely been more conversations and more action around what has taken place historically in this country. Racism in the agricultural system is it's a systemic issue, and so and it dates back decades, many years. When black folks lost so much of land, due to many different factors, but in particular due to the USDA and the federal policies that are in place that really support big ag in this country. And not the smaller farmer. It has really been a struggle. And so I think what I do see, some of the struggles here in the U.S., really being this land access issue, being able to have access to the land that farmers are asking for to be able to run their farm businesses, really seeing like access to GAP certification so that farmers are able to have their produce into bigger institutions such as our school systems. Access to loans. Obviously, we talked about the USDA and some of the loans and the struggles historically, but those are still some of the same struggles in the U.S. even now. Because in order to have a lively, thriving farm business, folks need access. And so, in addition to that, I would say that there's also lots of activism and lots of conversation and lots of mobility in for young Black farmers right now. There's been plenty, especially in my context where I'm situated, lots of young folks really coming into land stewardship. By way of the wisdom and the knowledge of Black farmers and indigenous growers and other land stewards. It's really beautiful seeing folks, really thinking about reparations in a different way when it comes to land stewardship, land ownership, those types of things. I'm seeing a lot of new urban growers, folks realizing that it may not take 20 acres of land for them to be able to be land stewards and grow food and form a food business. Seeing a lot of solidarity economies popping up. Also, lots of conversations about food systems work and really being connected to our state and local representatives who have a voice to be able to change the food system and make the food system what can work for more people in locally, certainly in our local context, but then also all over the United States as well. So there's a lot of I would say there's a lot of really incredible things happening here. And I think the thing that gives me the most hope and the most joy when it comes to Black farming, food systems, all things food, I think the thing that gives me the most joy is seeing the next generation coming up and really understanding land stewardship, and really understanding the how important it is for us to be in control of what we put in our bodies, and to be able to distribute that not only just to our respective communities, but all throughout our states and throughout this country. So those things are giving me hope right now when it comes to food and farming, and Black farming in particular.
Right, right. Lashona, you've created a really good segue to the next section where we talk about the futures. But I have one probing question that I wonder if you could speak to a little bit about is with the distribution systems being what they are, and with the difference in the way in which Black farmers have to rely on these gap certifications and so on. So you have a double whammy with the COVID crisis, right? The farmers markets have sort of been disappearing. And also you are in this gap that has not been, like, you're still trying to get spaces for redistribution via schools and so on. How has the COVID crisis sort of impacted the farmers now is what I'm curious about.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Certainly, COVID-19 is what do I say? Has revealed what, oftentimes a lot of us have already known to be true about our food system and our world in general. And now we've, sort of been able to uncover this in a way that everyone is able to see. So what I'm seeing in my context, lots of conversations about food hubs. And how, in a community context, how can we create spaces where food producers and restaurant owners and folks can come together and have a central location to be able to process and access food within our community. So I'm seeing food hubs really being a conversation piece right now, and a way for some mobility actually within my context. I'm also seeing you talk about farmers markets and access and all those things. I'm actually seeing Black farmers markets come to a place of real access and accessibility for Black farmers in my context. I'm a member of a Black farmers market here in North Carolina where I live. And that has been a real place for one, conversation. So farmers can be together and bounce ideas off of each other and connect. And so this networking has been really beautiful. And for myself as a new farmer, I'm able to connect with some farmers who've been in this for a very long time, who can help me along the journey and give me the knowledge and the insight that I need to be able to run a business that's going to be sustainable. So the Black farmers market allows for Black farmers and food producers to be together in a space. For one, we also we're selling, so we're generating income for our respective businesses. We're in community with the shoppers who come through, and certainly not just black shoppers, but certainly open to the entire community. So I'm seeing Black farmers markets be a different what's the word, an alternative to these sort of traditional farmers markets, which we know in the U.S. have historically been white, and historically and exclusively been for white farmers. And so now we're opening up spaces where we're saying, hey, we're going to have a Black space where Black farmers can come and be together and be with community. And these have been especially sacred spaces, not just a place for me to highlight what I'm selling and what I'm growing, but also a sacred space in that this is cultivated by Black people and for Black people. So I'm seeing those things happen in my context, and I believe the food hubs can actually be a real place to allow for new and beginning growers to have the access to to a facility to be able to do the things they need to do. With the GAP certification, it's always a struggle, and I believe that this is where our real activism and voices should be heard, in the spirit of talking to these elected officials and working towards a better way to be able to get our local fresh produce into institutions, and in particular in my context into schools, so that our children can have access to better nutritious foods in their school system.
Thank you. Thank you. Going back to Vikas, thank you. Vikas, I know that the structure of both the redistribution system, the distribution system, the way in which non-state and state actors are playing in India is very, very different. So I was wondering if you could speak to what the current implications are, both for the farmers and for livelihood for both, like the farmers and the farm workers, and spell that out a little bit for us, and what the future looks like for them. Can't hear you.
Yeah. Now, just to put this in context first, one is, as I said, Indian agriculture has been going through a terrible crisis now for some time. Along with this, we were facing a serious employment crisis, and this was before COVID struck. Even before COVID struck, we had employment surveys of the government showing that the unemployment rates were more than what has been seen in last 4 or 5 decades. And then COVID struck. And as Rohini was talking about the whole migrant crisis that came with the lockdown. In fact, it was not really the COVID crisis. It was a lockdown crisis. It was a crisis created by the state, which imposed this nationwide lockdown without any preparation whatsoever, without thinking of its implications on the livelihoods of a vast majority of India's people. And then when it sort of created this crisis, instead of focusing on providing relief to the people, it actually used that crisis as an opportunity. In fact, and they were very explicit about it. A whole range of spokespersons of the government went on record to say that this is an opportunity we must use to bring about changes that we were unable to do in normal times. There is lockdown, protests are not allowed, people cannot speak up. So this is a moment that cannot be wasted. And that was the whole context in which these laws were brought about. In fact, government agricultural laws as per Indian constitutions, are normally the domain of the state government. State governments make laws, and the central government, the national government, tried to get the state governments to bring about new laws in the month of April and May, and then they realized it was too valuable an opportunity to waste on haggling with state governments. So in June, they decide to bring about national laws. In fact, in my view, violating the constitution. So there is that, and along with this, liberalizing the whole sort of deregulation of labor laws, the labor codes. So increasing the minimum working hours, the maximum working hours from 8 to 12, and completely throwing away regulations in respect of hiring and firing, or imposition of minimum wages and so on. So basically, you've used pandemic as an opportunity to bring about these changes that you would not have been able to do in normal times. So that's really what the nature of this change has been. Uh, what it means for the future, I think there are two sides to it. One is that clearly the farmers have shown the way. Farmers basically got up and said, "Sorry, we are not going to take this." And when everybody was almost at a loss, how to handle this assault on people's livelihood, farmers got up and they've shown the light. So that's one side of it. The other is that with the kind of protests that have happened, one clearly finds a sort of very concerted effort to build solidarities across classes, across communities, and across regions, to fight this out. So in the protests, I mean, it's really interesting, and these are protests being led by farmers union, which were historically considered unions of rich peasants and so on. The main slogan is unity of peasants and workers. So the main slogan that's being shouted day in and day out from there is unity of peasants and workers, long live. That, along with this, a very explicit and sort of clear recognition that divisive communal politics is a problem that we have to fight, and we are not going to let this movement be derailed using those kinds of tactics. And the third, to, as I said, build solidarities across states, across regions. And what started as protests from Punjab and Haryana has really spread across the country. You have seen protests happening in almost all state capitals and in all major towns and villages. Massive public meetings happening all over the place in solidarity, because there are still restrictions on travel. So people in large numbers cannot travel from far off places to the national capital. So solidarities of all these three kinds in particular, across classes, across communities and religions, and regional. That's been the focus of people who are protesting, while the powers that be are using various divisive ways of weakening the struggle. Those who are protesting have consciously worked to build these solidarities.
Right, right, right. Rohini, can I ask you to come in and also speak? Because around the same time that the farmers were marching across, there were also migrant workers who were marching. There have been many demands that have been placed in the farm workers movement and elsewhere about employment guarantees and security of livelihood. Could you speak to those connections and what it might mean in terms of new politics that is emerging?
Yeah, actually, yes, I'd just like to expand on what Vikas was saying, because he was talking about the kinds of divisions that that the government has been trying to use against the movement. And in fact, when we look closely, we can see cracks that may be closing, as he says, that solidarity may be bringing people together. But I feel they still need a lot of repair work to be done. So, for example, the divisions resulting from religious communalism, which have been promoted assiduously by this government. Now, there's not much hostility between Sikhs and Muslims. In fact, Sikhs had even come and prepared food for protesters against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which discriminates against Muslims, and most of the demonstrators were Muslims. So there was a very expression of solidarity there. But some of the Hindu farmers from Haryana and especially UP have been supporters of a Hindu nationalist agenda. And some of them may even have participated in anti Muslim pogroms, which resulted in chasing Muslims out of Muzaffarnagar in western UP in 2013. Um, Now, in spite of that, Muslim farmers have been coming along with the others, with the Hindu and Sikh farmers. When an interviewer asked some of the farmers from UP a question about the riots, one said quietly, they shouldn't have happened. Another said more loudly, there are no Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Christian divisions here. We are all farmers. But I think we can't take such declarations purely at face value. And it remains to be seen if these divisions have been healed. And I suspect some work still remains to be done. Now, the second division is the one you specifically asked about, which is between the the owners of the farms and the workers. And in India, it overlaps to a very great extent with the caste division, with the caste Hindus being mostly the farm owners and Dalits who have suffered terrible oppression and still do, being the farm workers, laborers. But they too have been participating in the movement in great numbers. Now, the vast majority of rural Dalits are landless. Sorry. But some do rent land and cultivate it. For them, of course, the minimum support price is even more crucial because they have to pay rent on top of everything else. Others demand plots to be assigned to them from common land, that's the panchayat land, and they fear this will be swallowed up by agribusinesses if they take over. Others feel the wages they are paid as laborers depend on their employers, the farmers, getting a decent price for their crops. So, for all these reasons, they have a common interest. Also, the laws attack landless Dalits from another angle too. Now, their families would be dependent on the public distribution system of subsidized food, which would be disrupted by these laws, as Vikas was explaining. So, that's another reason why they're protesting alongside the farmers. So hopefully that these expressions of solidarity, and it's true that many of the unions combine farmers and farm workers and are making a conscious effort to promote solidarity. But there is still, I think, tension on a caste basis between the Hindus and the Dalits, the caste Hindus and Dalits, which will need to be worked on. And last but not least, women. When the Supreme Court asked the protesters, why don't you send the women home? There was outrage among the women protesters who played a prominent part in the struggle. In fact, if you include the women whose husbands are farmers, which you should because they too work on the farms, then I would say there are more women farmers than men. Because when men migrate in search of employment, it's the women who take over running the farm. And in the tragic cases where the men commit suicide too, women take over. Some of the women participating in the protests have been vocal in denouncing the devaluation of women promoted by Hindu nationalist ideology. And it seems likely, hopefully, that this struggle will provide momentum to a parallel struggle against a deeply patriarchal and misogynist culture.
Yeah.
In fact, if we stay with women, they have been pioneers in exploring one important solution, what I feel is an important solution to the agrarian crisis, namely forming cooperatives. Wherever they have formed cooperatives, they have been able to earn more than farmers working on their own. And this experiment could be developed and expanded to solve many problems. Agricultural cooperatives, which include landless laborers on an equal basis, would not only be able to negotiate better prices, they would also be able to share machinery and tractors, thus reducing the debt that is incurred when they are bought. They could diversify production into other food grains, into lentils and dals, into vegetables, set up repair workshops, and create storage and processing facilities. They could even produce their own renewable energy and organic fertilizer, thus solving some of the major problems farmers suffer today. So I think on this point there are a lot of possibilities if the if this idea of forming cooperatives, uh, which has been initiated by women farmers, can be more uh, widely implemented by farmers as well as farm laborers. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you. There is also an interesting experiment that had come out in the 70s and 80s when there was a deepening sort of employment crisis, where Dalit groups in Maharashtra, like namely Dalit Yuvak Aghadi, for example, they had done these things of like bringing overlapping caste groups and taking over like commons and farming, and that kind of intersection or solidarity between people in actual production process or in terms of like coming together and struggle really brings in a certain sense, creates opportunities for that kind of relational overlap, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. um, I want to actually ask Lashona to sort of weigh in at this moment, to also talk to us partly about the kinds of experiments or the kinds of new ways of thinking about control over land you had started talking about, and the new solidarity economies. Like if you could speak to that, and also speak a little bit about like what does like if you have only 0.5% land holding spread out among all of these black farmers, what does land holding and what does the gender question look like? Where does a black woman fit in the struggles?
Yeah, thanks for that. Um, so yes, definitely new and how do I say this? I feel like liberating and revolutionary conversations around solidarity economies. What does that look like? How do communities engage? Um, and I'm seeing in my context where there's a lot of cooperative models that are being sort of put forward, and also just really thinking about some historical models that have been in place for many years. And I'm thinking about folks like Ella Baker, and I'm thinking about even some of the farmers sort of in the Midwest and in the North now that are really practicing solidarity economies and cooperatives, and it's really in the spirit of putting resources together, that even black farmers, black people in general in these United States, have been a people in the struggle, historically, and always within community, pooling resources to be able to literally make something out of nothing in this country. And so I'm seeing a lot of food practitioners. I'm seeing a lot of farmers. I'm seeing a lot of restaurant owners and people interested in the food system coming together in that way. What do you have, and what do you have, and how can we pull those resources together so that we can see the things that we want to see within our communities? And those are beautiful. And to tell you a little quick story about just about a community that I'm situated in, and within my farm, and the land that I've been able to be a steward of. And so this isn't just about the 20 acres of land. There's a home there, and soon there'll be additional homes there. That can also be a way of supporting some people who are in need of safe, affordable housing. And so this farm is going to serve not just as a food, a place of food, and really being connected to the dirt in that way, but also being able to offer support for community members who need housing. There's going to be a gathering space, and it'll be a Black space where there can be some Black joy and some offerings for Black people to come and be able to just rest a little while and be able to experience that Black joy and that love in that way as well. And so this is more than just growing food. This is more than just acquiring land. There's a whole way of being that I'm seeing happen within these cooperatives, within these solidarity economies, and also pooling resources together to be able to build. The other part of your question around the decline, you said, with only 0.5% of farmers in this country being Black, what are folks doing? And so certainly within the solidarity economy, certainly within ways of building together and strengthening community, certainly within the Black farmers market that I told you about, this is a whole different way of being within community that is that's outside of this whole colonial way of taking and extracting. And this is more about giving back and being with, and this is a whole different mindset that I'm seeing come forth. Swati, ask me your other question again. I may have lost it.
I was curious about how many Black women farmers are there, and how do they fit in the story, and what are their struggles?
Oh yes, Black women. I believe. I believe we rule the world, and if folks can just get behind Black women, I think all of our struggles would go away. Like seriously, I see so many beautiful, brilliant, amazing Black women in land stewardship, in farming, in teaching about agribusiness, and so again, quick story. I'll be brief. My situation started in the dining room of my home. I'm a mom of 4. I'm married. I'm now entering my midlife, and 5 years ago, I said, look, I need to do something, and I want to do something, and I want to reclaim land, and I want to reclaim food for my people. And I started in the dining room of my home with some little compostable seed cups and some dirt, a few seeds, and I started growing seedlings in my home. And then that just morphed into a little bit more, and situated only on a 1/4 acre of land. So literally only had my backyard to do anything with. And I started composting and learning more about compost. I started learning more about permaculture. I started learning more about being a steward of the land, and giving to instead of taking from. And so my farm business started in my dining room as a mother of 4 and a wife working full time, and just continued to grow and grow. And it was a backyard garden. But I'm the one that went to the farm services office in my community and said, I want this to be a farm. And they gave me a farm ID number. And so I started building a farm business, even without a large amount of farm property. Right. And so my mentality had to shift from what I thought farming was to what farming was actually being within my context and with whatever piece of land I had. And so from there, my farm has just continued to just move and take on new forms and continue to build. And I'm still situated in the same home with that 1/4 acre, with 20 raised beds in the back, growing a lot of beautiful herbs and flowers. And then I also have this other piece of property. And so I think what I'm seeing for women is that Black women are really supporting each other, and we're really living into our full potential, and we can be homemakers, and we can be moms and wives and all the things, and we can be farmers, and we can be teachers, and we can be sisters, and all that love and that joy that we're getting from the land as we continue to cultivate and be good land stewards. We're giving back to our community to continue to build up. And I'm always of the belief that, when we raise up a Black woman, and particularly when we raise up a transgendered Black woman, we all rise when we do that.
We have a few minutes left. I'm actually curious. I want to jump back from something that you said, Lashana, to ask Vikas and Rohini also about this question. Um, Either of you could respond. Is the problem with cash crop is the dependency on the market, and so everything, the volatility of the market shapes everything, and it's a double sort of alienation. You are continually producing something for the market, so you have to sell everything, go to the market for your sale, but also go to the market for buying like daily goods, and consumer prices are going up. So in this double moment of alienation, like how do the farmers think about allotting a different kind of farm practice that allows them to have some sustainability while producing for the market? Is there land enough for that? Have the cropping practices changed, and what does that mean going forward for food security? I guess I'm curious about, of the farmer.
I think Vikas, you would know more about that than I do.
All right. Okay. I think, you see, it's more complex than this. Frankly, you see, we are living in a world in which, you know uh, you have the market, and people who are not directly engaged in agricultural production obtain their food through the market. That's the primary mode through which food and other things get distributed in the population. So, given that, you know there is there is no other way that the economy would function except by farmers producing surplus, selling it in the market, using it to satisfy their non-food requirements, as well as uh, other sections of the society depending on farmers for their food supplies. So that dependency is unavoidable, and if you're going to have that, you're going to have markets, you're going to have farmers producing for the market. The problem we have is not just that. The problem is that you're talking of markets that are, on the one hand, controlled by this monopoly capital, and in which the whatever spaces were there for state to intervene to both protect interests of farmers and interests of consumers, those possibilities have become weaker. So I don't particularly think that we should live with this romanticized notion that farmers, we can go back into this sort of village republics or Gandhian kind of idea of farmers just producing for themselves and not consuming anything other than what they produce. You see, so I think what one needs is to build resistance against this sort of monopoly capitalism and the state serving the interests of these dominant classes. That's where one should be looking for if one's thinking of future. The future lies, in my view, most importantly in building resistance against these. In fact, I would even go on to say that give I mean, the thing that Rohini was talking about, using, for example, things like cooperatives, for me, in the contemporary Indian context, I think most important role that such activities can play is to strengthen that resistance. I am not terribly hopeful, you know, of the possibility of getting huge economic gains within the constraints of the kind of state we have right now through small scale cooperative action. But that kind of cooperative action could certainly be very useful in bringing people together and in building these solidarities and resistance against the monopoly capitalism and the neoliberal state. So that possibility, I think, is extremely important. So whatever ways, uh, institutional mechanisms we can think of to build that resistance, one has to use. And I think that is an extremely important possibility.
Right. So before we head on, there are many questions and many comments here, but I am going to just clarify a little bit of where I was coming from, because it's not the Gandhian model as much as the interesting thing. What I was picking from what Lashona was saying, and I think that that is a conversation that we need to have as well in India, is that there are two options for farmers. I mean, and there have been two sort of expressions of their crisis. One has been suicide, and the other has been protest. And the space, and there is a distinction between which places the suicides have come from, like in terms of the way in which the market, in terms of land holding, in terms of what crops are produced, in terms of the volatility of the market, the debt crisis. So Punjab, in that sense, is kind of really instructive in the way in which, and so are places in southern India, very instructive in the way in which, how do you avoid from a despair which leads to a suicide to a protest. Like, and so I was coming from that perspective of thinking about, like, you need to have some sustainability of the movement of the farmer in order to actually even put a resistance forward. And I think that in that sense, like thinking about food, or sustainability and so on, would actually be like sort of tied into life or politics of life, I guess, in some ways. But I don't want to, I mean, there are lots of questions, so I'm going to start them in the order that they have been asked. Um, uh, Lachona, there is a question for you from Satya, and I'm going to have it here. He's basically asking you, what about the black agricultural laborers and sharecroppers who constituted a large number than landed farmers?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I won't try to pronounce your name. I know I'll mess it up, but I see you and I appreciate the question. So for Black folks in this country historically, this has been a story of Black farm workers and then sharecroppers, and then we have to go again back into the history of this country, to see why things are situated the way they are. We can think about the 1935, the Social Security Act, which gave old age benefits, but excluded agriculture and domestic workers, which were predominantly Black and brown folks in this country at that time. And so I think from my own historical context, my own family as sharecroppers, and then my great grandfather was able to obtain some land and become he was a hog farmer and produced vegetables, and I'm that's where I got my roots in ag from my great grandfather. I think the conversation begins to become in this country, and it always has been. It's not a new conversation for the U.S. Is when do we begin to see the repair? When do we begin to see the repair from a history of racism in the United States that excluded Black folks? And the ideas of Black farmers, we have to begin to have the conversation about repair. So I think for today, when it comes to this historical context. We are seeing that more African American Black people in the United States are engaging in conversations about agriculture, are engaging in farming. Certainly, there are still farm workers, but we're actually becoming land stewards ourselves, and landowners, and being able to come to the table now. But it has taken a very, very, very long time in this country for any forward mobility to even begin to happen. And, I think we also sort of sometimes like compare what's happening with Black people in agriculture to white people. And for me, while that's valid, but I think for me, I'm not necessarily doing that. I'm not trying to catch up with white folks in agriculture in this country. I think I'd kill myself doing that. But more in the spirit of, how do I now reclaim land and food for me as an individual, for my family and my community as a collective, and not so much worry about sort of catching up to what white farmers have in this country. I'm not sure if this is answering your question or not, but what I really want to say is that this is a history of the United States, to exclude farm workers, and not just Black farm workers, but in the context of what I'm talking about today, not just Black farm workers, but farm workers and sharecroppers. I also want to just mention that when it comes to sharecropping, farm workers, the enslavement of African peoples. There's a lot of trauma and a lot of history there and a lot of trauma that has to be dealt with, and it's generational trauma that has been handed down from generation to generation when it comes to agriculture and being connected to the land, and the abuse, and the trauma and the torture and the lynching and all of the things that happen during the enslavement of African peoples.
Thank you. There's another question again for you, Lashana. So Lala wants to know if you could have some book recommendations because he's trying to understand a little bit about food systems.
Oh, yes,
Or
for
they.
sure. For sure. I wish I had them all right here with me. I would say perhaps you start with Freedom Farmers by Monica White. Um, Beautiful, brilliant about food cooperatives and all things Black farming. Just really brilliant and beautiful work by her. I would say next you should pick up Farming While Black. Just another really brilliant and beautiful piece by Leah Penniman. Right here in front of me, I've been skimming back through The Cooking Gene by Michael Twitty. Brilliant, beautiful, um, gay Black man who just gives all the things that make sense around food in a historical context. What else am I reading? I've got over here, I've just picked up More Than Just Food. Food Justice and Community Change. You should grab that one. I haven't read it yet, but I heard really, really great things about it. That's enough. That's four that'll get you started. But there's so many amazing pieces out, books that you can pick up and think about. Um, yeah, I'll stop there.
Um, there's another comment. I guess it doesn't require that much. It's not a question, it's a compliment. But I also I meant to create space, and I'm sorry. I should have done this early on. Is for a conversation that or questions that you all might have for each other, or clarifications that you all might have for each other.
Yeah, I was really interested in what Lashana was saying, and I think it opens up a lot of possibilities here and connects up with the whole idea of um, where women have gone into cooperative farming more than men. And I think it is partly the idea of creating the kind of space he was talking about. So I guess we could really learn from each other's experience if we knew. I am unfortunately not, I haven't studied farming very much. I'm more a labor person. So I've worked more with urban workers than with farm workers or farmers. But there too, I feel there's a lot that, I mean, as I was talking about these migrant workers, there are hundreds of millions of them. In 2016, it was estimated there were about 400 million migrant workers, and I'm sure there are a lot more by now. That's people from villages who can't sustain themselves in the villages and who then travel around the country, thousands of miles sometimes, looking for work and move from place to place. Um, but they have to keep a connection with the village. And that's partly to do with the lack of employment, the lack of decent employment. So there too, I see as future in cooperatives. Again, as Vikas was saying, we can't expect anything from this current government. I don't know if there's any future beyond it. But at least whatever we can do, I think it has to be doing it together, you know, because if people are divided, we can be smashed one by one, as we've seen. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with Rohini. I think there's a lot to be there's a lot that I can learn from you with your wisdom and your knowledge um, of the labor sector, and then when you were talking about what my context, I think when the two come together, it creates a really beautiful movement. And so more, mostly I'm focused on community organizing. I do grassroots work, and so I want to be in community and with community and moving at the speed of community. And I agree with you. I think there's so much to learn from each other and in partnership with each other. So I appreciate you being here today.
Lashana, could I ask you a question? Uh, for uh, small farmers like you and others you were talking about, in particular black farmers, to what extent are they able to benefit from the state support, of different kinds? But for example, the farm support that's provided by the government, are these available to small farmers? And or are there certain forms of support that are specifically for small farmers and sharecroppers and black farmers? Is there some kind of framework under which state provides support?
To answer your question, yes, there are resources available. Now, can um, black farmers, women farmers, historically marginalized farmers get access to that? Hey, depends on how you navigate the system, right? It's really tricky sometimes. So available, yes. Accessible, maybe not so much. I think, particularly for black farmers, there are, a number of USDA programs that new, young, black, urban growers, certainly there are a number of ways that people can, seemingly engage. I think it becomes extremely difficult when it comes to land ownership, and ways in which these programs oftentimes keep people from being able to possess some land. And so there, then what I've been seeing is, folks who aren't able to just, own some land, they may end up having to lease some land. I mean, then there's certain things that you can do, and and you can't do, and depending on who's holding the ownership to the land. And so it's always, I believe it's still really tricky to navigate. And I do believe that there's a difference between what's available and what's accessible, in terms of people being able to actually be able to realize their goals and their dreams, in terms of farming. I think also, just in my context, I haven't received any of those offerings, from the USDA. I, and that's why it's been a really slow process for me, and one that I've just been on this journey for a little while now, to be able to save up enough money to be able to do the things that I need to do. I possess a hand me down greenhouse from another black farmer who was upgrading and doing some things at his farm. He said, "Look, I've got a greenhouse. Here you go." And I mean, something as simple as a greenhouse, right? But that can be a barrier to a new farmer when you're trying to, cultivate and get your things started. If you don't have what you need, it's very difficult to do that. So that's just one example. I think in terms of loans, I went through a non-traditional way of receiving financing to be able to purchase the property. And that worked for us. Others may be able to navigate the system in a way to be able to get the loans they need. So it's kind of a touch and go. It's not a one size fits all for that. And still extremely difficult because we can see the numbers that show that we still only have, in the big scale of things, we only have a handful of black farmers in this country.
I think along the same lines as Vikas was asking, we have a really nice question from Interpal as well. Is Could any of you speak about the question of subsidies, for instance, that white farmers receive in the US or in other global regions?
Actually, in some ways, I think in the WTO, if I'm not mistaken, the minimum support price for Indian farmers has been treated as a subsidy. And at some point, and possibly still now, it has been opposed by the US as being an unfair trade practice, which I think is completely the wrong way of looking at it. On the one hand, I would see it much more as a way of Indian farmers getting a living wage, I mean, without which they could not survive, and being able to sustain food security. On the other hand, as this question makes clear, farmers in the US get huge subsidies as well as in Europe and elsewhere. So it seems a bit unfair to, to object to um,
Mhm.
what is actually a means of survival for poor farmers in the, of course, there are rich farmers also getting subsidies, but it's a matter of survival for poor farmers. Um, on the grounds that then it constitutes an obstacle to competition. So I think if there are subsidies, it should be aimed at two things. One is the survival of the farmers and the food growers and the people who live on the land, the rural workers. And secondly, it should be aimed at food security, and that doesn't mean just um, you know surviving. It should mean having a good balanced diet, a healthy diet, and people should be able to afford, which the major part of the population in India doesn't have. So that again is something that we really need to aim for, proper nutritious food for everyone. And if subsidies are needed for that, yes, I would support them.
If I may say a few things, I think one is one needs to differentiate between subsidies that are required, for poor farmers, and subsidies that are being given to
Yes,
big corporate farms and so on. The
precisely.
other is that one needs to understand that in third world countries like India, you know, countries like India need to produce their own food. I mean, it's a very large country. Its food requirements are huge, and there's no way a country like India could depend on international markets for obtaining its food supplies. If that is the case, that is, if India has to produce its food, there is no way of doing it without subsidies. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, India would not. I mean, agriculture would come to a standstill in India if you did not have subsidies and systems of procurement. So, I mean, if you think that for large countries like India in particular, but to some extent, basically for most countries, I mean, producing the food, in particular the key food commodities, is an important requirement. You need to allow them that space to ensure that, and subsidies are an extremely important instrument in achieving that.
Yeah.
I want
Um, no, go
I
ahead,
want to make
Rosanna.
sure I'm not going over time. I don't have much to contribute to this question, but I will say that just last year in this country under the Trump administration, there's a lot of money given out um, to farmers during the COVID-19 situation at the beginning, and Mm, I don't know a ton about it, but what I do know is that the majority of that money was given out to white farmers. And it's for those the commodity crops, soy and wheat and whatnot. And I think that this is who we are in America. We keep talking about the history, but honestly, it's our racist past and our racist present. The USDA is continually caught up in these things, in this distribution. And so I don't want to be long winded, but I'll just say that this is just who we are in these United States. And we've had this historically. No doubt it's still continuing now, and some of us are just trying to push through the incredible wall of white supremacy in the United States, to find our liberation and to reclaim our food and reclaim our livelihood and our connection with the land.
Um, yeah, there's one last question which kind of really ends the session very nicely. Let me put it up here. And I think it's for all of us. What are the effective ways to build international solidarity today?
That's a big question.
Should I say this? We've built some a little bit today.
Yeah, sure, yes. Yeah. And actually, another point which came out of the previous question as well is the whole question of the environment, isn't it? And that is partly why farming is so important, because as Lakshana was saying, it's there has been a history of simply taking and taking and taking from the earth, taking from the soil, cutting down trees, destroying the earth really. And we need to come up with ways of giving back and replenishing it if we want to continue to survive. And from that point of view, too, I think, if we're building solidarity around farming, that point also needs to be made, that we need to have agricultural systems which preserve the earth really and don't destroy it. Yeah, maybe we can, yeah, as in this case, build solidarity around that. Yeah.
I think it starts right here, right now, today, and in sessions like this. Building together, realizing that our struggle is connected, that this is a global struggle, not unique to the United States, even though that's where I am and in my context, and not unique to anywhere else, but to really see ourselves together as one peoples, and I think that that's how we begin to build, and we can sustain that by being intentional about being together and staying connected in what ways seem meaningful.
Thank you so much, all of you. We're almost at the end of our session, and I know it's very late in India. So, I wanted to say a couple of things. Is I think that we should figure out a way to have continuing conversations, and I think that is one of the things to have internal conversations around. The second thing is thank you so much for coming, both the speakers as well as all of you audience. Like the questions were fantastic. Um, and we had a little bit of a snafu, like a technical snafu with the audio at the start. So as we disperse, I think we're going to play the song again, the Bella Ciao song by the Balladeers. So stay in tune for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Still no sound.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. And I want to just give a last shout out to all of our friends who have come out in solidarity with this, putting this event together, the Boston South Asia Collective, Solidarity, Internationalism from Below, the Revive the Peace Movement, and the AfroSoc DSA caucus. So thank you all so much. And yeah, thank you. Bye bye.